After Sonic had released 4 successful and well-received games on the SEGA Genesis and its accompanying add-on, the SEGA CD, a new generation of consoles were on the horizon, with the PS1 releasing in 1995 and the Nintendo 64 releasing in 1996, as well as SEGA getting their hands dirty in 1995 with the release of the SEGA Saturn, as well as the SEGA 32X, another add-on to the SEGA Genesis. Seeing as Sonic was critical to SEGA's success since he came onto the scene, it was important for SEGA to headline their new hardware with more installments in the Sonic series. Here's the catch though. SEGA really tried hard to do this, but they failed horribly. 1995 through 1997 were absolute stinker years for Sonic the Hedgehog. Absolutely nothing good was released during this time period, especially if you include the Game Gear games from the last video that were released during this time frame. The game that started this rocky time period for Sonic was 1995's Knuckles' Chaotix, released for the SEGA Genesis' second console add-on, the SEGA 32X. Amazing decision by SEGA to release an add-on for the Genesis the same month that they released a brand new console, the SEGA Saturn. Basically, the SEGA 32X's purpose was to increase the SEGA Genesis' power, bringing it from a 16-bit console into a 32-bit console. Why you would release this add-on at the same time as your brand new console, I have absolutely no idea. But back to Chaotix, how can a game that is seemingly just like another classic Sonic game be the game that kicks off such a dark time for the franchise? Because this game, simply put, is hot trash. Now, what is Knuckles' Chaotix's worst offense as a game? This game is super boring and at times pretty annoying. To start, this game introduces a bunch of new characters. If you're a fan of the series, then the term Chaotix should ring a bell. This game marks the first appearances of Espio the Chameleon, Vector the Crocodile, Charmy Bee, and Marty the Armadillo. This being a Knuckles-centric game while also introducing a slew of new characters meant that Sonic and Tails were nowhere to be seen throughout the course of the game. Now, why do I talk about all this after stating that this game is annoying? Because one of this game's core mechanics is how you control 2 characters, akin to the Sonic and Tails campaigns with Sonic 2 and 3, but both characters you control are held together by a ring and a tether. This is something that can be really annoying sometimes. It can feel like the character's movement options are very limited, like if the player gains too much speed over the second character, you'll just stop dead in your tracks and be forced to regain that speed again. Which means if you get to a part where you have to run up a wall or something like that, then guess what? You're gonna drop all the way to the bottom and you gotta regain all that speed just for that same thing to happen once again. Which leads me into another one of Knuckles' Chaotix's biggest problems. This game is so boring and it is very lifeless. Seriously, Sonic 1 had a lot of fun level design that was great for replayability, but Knuckles' Chaotix's levels just feel so empty. I felt like I was just holding left or right for most of the time and just occasionally jumping. And guess what? The developers thought it would be a good idea to increase the amount of acts from 2 from Sonic 3 to 5 in this game. With all of these boring as all hell levels, I'm sure as hell not sitting through all 5 acts of every single stage just to get to the end of the game. This game just has no interesting level design whatsoever. There's barely any enemies to speak of. These levels, again, just feel super empty. It doesn't help that not a single combination of characters feel different to play from another. All the characters have their own unique abilities. Knuckles can glide and climb walls, Espio can walk on walls and ceilings, Vector has a hypersonic-esque double jump but without the screen nuke, Mighty can cling to walls, and Charmy's flat out broken as he can fly endlessly without tiring out. If you're gonna try and sit through this whole game, use Charmy as your primary character so you can just blaze through these levels as fast as you possibly can, because not a single one of these combinations is fun to use at all. Each character has their own unique abilities, yeah, but these boring as all hell levels make it feel like every single thing is the same. I felt no different playing as Knuckles and Espio than I did playing as Vector and Charmy. I didn't even bother finishing this game because of how boring this game is. Like, seriously, I got enough footage that I needed for this video and I was like, fuck this shit, I don't want to finish this because I'm not having fun. Another thing I will give this game credit for is that it has some of the best music out of any Sonic game thus far, producing some very great tracks that are super upbeat. So all in all, Knuckles' Chaotix is definitely not a game worth playing at all. I'm definitely not going to revisit this game anytime soon because I just don't find many redeeming qualities with it. I mean, it was cool to play it just to say that I've played it and I'm one step closer to playing every single Sonic game, I guess. But like, I didn't have fun with it, so who cares? Gaming then started to shift over to the third dimension with the PS1 in 1995 and the Nintendo 64 in 1996. Crash and Spyro were coming onto the scene on the PS1, while other franchises like Mario and Zelda were making their 3D jumps with Super Mario 64 and The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, both of which are still heavily praised to this day, with Ocarina of Time being hailed as one of the greatest games of all time. Of course, every company is going to push their biggest IPs in order to sell units, so that meant that SEGA had to put out a Sonic game capable of matching what his competitors were putting out around the time. SEGA certainly tried, but the story of them doing so is so fucking tragic. If you're watching this, you've almost certainly at least heard of Sonic X-treme in some form. Sonic X-treme was supposed to be Sonic's leap into the third dimension for the 5th gen of consoles, but this game was in hell. To start, this game looks absolutely terrible based on the few trailers that it actually got, so it probably would have been a flop anyways, but this game is pretty much the definition of development hell, including the lead developers becoming ill and damn near dying, forcing them to resign from the project, leading to the whole thing getting cancelled in 1996. So, Sega's big Sonic game to sell units was officially off the table, so what was the next move for Sega? They took Sonic 3D Blast, a game set to be released on the SEGA Genesis that same year, and ported it over to the Sega Saturn. With 3D Blast, instead of going full 3D like we know today, Sega tried to do an isometric 2D game, giving the player the illusion of 3D, and the result of this attempt was Sonic 3D Blast. If I were to sum this game up in one word, it would be terrible. Making an isometric 2D game presents multiple problems for the developers. First, you can't make a normal 3D level where you go from point A to point B because you still can't entirely see what's in front of you, a problem that was present and quite frustrating in Sonic 2. Another problem is that, whatever you decide to make the objective, it generally limits the type of level design that you're able to pull off. What Sonic 3D Blast decided to do was sort of emulate the collect-a-thon idea that games like Super Mario 64 did. You have to save 5 flickies by defeating 5 enemies. The problem is that there are only 5 enemies throughout the whole level. The level design also doesn't allow for the same cool secrets that you would be able to find in the Genesis games. None of these levels have any cool or even semi-interesting set pieces either. There's not even any cool challenges you have to do to reach a certain enemy or anything. Now that just makes the game super boring to play, as there's almost no satisfaction in finding the enemies or saving the flickies, which would lead someone to believe that it's more of a mid-tier game than a terrible game. Now, let's get into why I think this game is, as I described earlier, absolutely terrible. Another problem that this level design faces, in addition to its boredom, is that platforming is an absolute fucking nightmare. Since this game decided to go with the isometric 2D route, it's damn near fucking impossible to tell where you're going to land, making any section where you have to platform unbearable. This also applies to destroying enemies. Jumping into enemies was the instinctive way to deal with enemies in the Genesis games. In Sonic 3D Blast, the isometric 2D camera angle makes doing this fucking impossible. Rolling into enemies sometimes works, but jumping into enemies is not a feasible method of attack anymore. There is this homing attack shield in the game that'll allow you to jump and then home in on an enemy, charging into them and killing them, but that is a power-up, so if you don't have that power-up, you're kinda screwed. Another thing that makes this game annoying to play is the controls. Remember how I said Sonic plays like he has a stick of butter strapped to his feet in the Game Gear games? For 3D Blast, think that, but like twice as bad. If you showed me how Sonic moved in this game and just removed the level visuals completely, I would think that every single level in this game is an ice level. Seriously, Sonic moves like he's on ice for the whole damn game, which also plays a part in this game being terrible to play. Trying to platform with a terrible camera angle and awful controls on top of that is an absolute nightmare. The special stages are also super annoying to get into. You're supposed to gather 50 rings, then find Tails or Knuckles, and then you'll be warped in. Better hope that Sonic doesn't slip into an enemy, because that would suck, wouldn't it? Once you get into the special stages though, they're just super boring. Why? Because they're piss easy and I could do these with my eyes closed. I mean, really, there is literally no variation in special stages besides the background, making these not just the easiest, but the most boring special stages in the entire series. That is, in the SEGA Genesis version. The SEGA Saturn version of the game has entirely different special stages, an entirely different soundtrack, and looks far better visually. But I'm not going to be going more in depth than that on the Saturn version because every single re-release of 3D Blast has just been the Genesis version, and thus, that's the only version that's really any sort of relevant. But regardless of what version of the game you're playing, it's still Sonic 3D Blast at the end of the day, which is just an inherently shitty game to play. Bad controls, bad structure, boring level design, it's just an overall mess of a game. I hated playing it when I was a kid, which says a lot, because I could tolerate some serious shit back in the day. And I still hate playing it to this day. Seriously, my most recent playthrough, I got to Volcano Valley and was just so appalled that I turned the game off and just never finished it. Now, just like any mascot actually worth anything, Sonic ventured off into different spin-off genres in order to attract a wider base. Something like this was needed, especially with all the shit coming out. Sonic had some spin-offs already, like Sonic Spinball, but the Saturn would see the release of a far more traditional spin-off game, and the only other spin-off game that's really worth a mention. Bringing me to the last game of today's video, we have Sonic R, released on the Sega Saturn in 1997. Let's start by saying, this game has an absolutely amazing concept that I hate that Sega hasn't revisited since. A platforming racing game is such a genius idea to me that I'm genuinely shocked that it hasn't been at least attempted once since. Now, with that being said, is Sonic R as good as its concept would have you think? Short answer is no. If you were to ask me, I'd say that the first thing a racing game needs to do well in order to succeed is have good controls. If the game feels like it's shit to play, then the game probably just isn't going to be that fun. That is Sonic R's biggest flaw. This game's controls are absolutely abysmal. Sonic 3D Blast controls were way too slippery, and Sonic R's controls, which was developed by the same team that developed 3D Blast, has movement that is very stiff and as a result, not very good. But the absolute worst part of this movement is how fucking god-awful the turning is in this game. Now, if the courses were mostly straight lines with slight deviation allowing for alternate routes, then this wouldn't be as big of a problem as it is. But the problem is that you have sections like this where you have to stop dead in your tracks and wait for the sluggish turns to be completed. This is not a character-specific thing either, mind you. If it was just a thing that applied to, let's say, Knuckles but had no effect on Sonic, it would still be a problem, but not nearly as big of a problem. Speaking of character-specific controls, much like Sonic 3 and Knuckles, some characters have their own abilities, giving you incentive to play as them instead of other characters. Sonic is the fastest, has a double jump, Tails can fly, Knuckles can glide. The courses, much like the levels of Sonic 3 and Knuckles, are designed in such a way where these abilities can actually make a difference. Not in such a way to where one character is broken compared to another, but definitely enough to warrant playing as the other characters. These abilities still don't make the game that fun to play because guess what? Even with them adding the replayability to this game, the base controls are still awful. I mean, 3D Blast and R were developed by the same team, so I guess that explains why they both control like garbage. You can unlock new characters like Metal Sonic by collecting Sonic tokens in each stage, but here's the problem. In a racing game, my objective is to get to the end as fast as I can, and before the other racers. So why would I go out of my way to look for these tokens when that could put me in jeopardy of losing the race? Like, yeah, obviously you would start up a race with the sole intention of getting the token, not caring about your placement, but regardless, I don't feel like doing all that grinding in a racing game, especially when Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles are clearly good enough to the point where I'm not going to lose with them, giving me no incentive to unlock any other characters. Another reason why exploring for Sonic tokens suck, and yes, I'm going to say it again, the game's god-awful controls make me not even want to bother trying to look for them. But now it's time for me to talk about Sonic R's best and debatably only good quality, and that being the soundtrack. This OST is comprised entirely of vocal tracks done by Richard Jocks and TJ Davis, and guess what? As out of place as these tracks might be, Sonic R's OST is filled with bangers. Let's take a listen.
Everybody super Sonic racing, try to keep your feet right on the ground. When you're super Sonic racing, there's no time to look around. Can you feel the sunshine? Does it brighten up the day? Don't you feel that sometimes you just need to run away? You know you have to survive. You got to keep the dream alive, where everything is free. Can't you see?
And well, that's just about all I can really say for Sonic R, and thus really all I can say for this video. This time period was quite rough, and looking back, this very well could have killed Sonic and Sega as a whole. Sega's mascot was putting up consistent Tony Snell stat lines, and on top of that, the Saturn was selling like absolute garbage, for a bunch of reasons, but one of those reasons, I'm sure, was the lack of quality content from their main killer, Sonic the Hedgehog. I know people commonly refer to the mid to late 2000s as the dark age of Sonic, but I honestly don't think that the time period I covered in this video is undeserving of that title either. And hell, I'd even say that this time period is even more deserving of that label, since putting out pure stinkers left, right, and center, and having your big console absolutely tank very well could have killed most video game mascots, and quite honestly, I think it's a miracle that it didn't kill Sonic the Hedgehog. But despite this absolute disaster, Sega would not back out of the console business, and Sonic Team would not stop trying to make a truly epic 3D Sonic blockbuster. But we can talk about all that in another video. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys next time.